have an invocation by Amy Allen. And Amy, I'll ask you to unmute yourself and introduce yourself and then lead us.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you all. Halito. My name is Amy Allen, and I'm a PhD student at NATES, which stands for the North American Institute for Indigenous Theological Studies. However, we've recently outgrown our acronym because now we have networks that reach as far as where Dawn is located at, New Zealand, Australia, Philippines, South America, Taiwan, and so forth. So we keep the NATES, but we've added NATE and Indigenous Learning Community as the name of the organization. And it's quite unique as it is the first Indigenous developed, designed, and governed theological institute to be accredited by the Association of Theological Schools. So it's kind of a unique place, and I am very grateful to be there. I'm also a postulant in the Episcopal Church in the Diocese of Chicago. And so it's lovely to be with you all this evening, and thank you for the invitation. I look forward to further discussions with you all in November, where we'll discuss together a bit of my work on the First Nations version translation. And for our invocation this evening, I'd like to read a psalm for you from the project that we are finishing up next week, actually. We are completing Psalms and Proverbs. I'm a Hebrew consultant on the project. And so tonight, let's just take a moment to breathe in and breathe out. I'm going to read for you from the First Nations version, Sacred Song 100, a song for giving thanks. Let all who walk the earth shout to Grandfather. Serve Grandfather with glad hearts. Come before him with singing and dancing. Make it known that Grandfather is the Great Spirit. He created us for himself. We are his people, the sheep he watches over with tender care. Enter the sacred circle and dance in step with a drum as we sing honor songs. Send up prayers of thanksgiving and bless his name. For Grandfather is good with a love so strong, it never ends. He is faithful and true to 7 generations and beyond. Aho.
Thank you, Amy. That's wonderful.
Amen. Yes, thank you, Amy.
Aho.
To hear more and read more of those Psalms. So my name is Daniel London. I'm part of the executive committee. I'm an Episcopal priest in Eureka, California. And I spent part of my sabbatical last summer as a visiting scholar at St. John's Theological College in Auckland, New Zealand, where I had the pleasure of meeting today's speaker, Dr. Don Moffatt. Don is the Sir Paul Reeves Lecturer in Biblical Studies at St. John's Theological College in Auckland, New Zealand. So as we were talking about earlier, he's actually coming to us from the future, at least for me. I'm here in Thursday afternoon, California. He's Friday morning in New Zealand. So this is cutting edge pedagogy and biblical studies. It's from the future. Don has academic interests in issues of biblical interpretation, including social scientific approaches to biblical studies and particularly to the Hebrew Bible. His doctoral work at the University of Otago examined the social, political, and cultural reasons for the ban on outsider marriages in Persian-era Judah, recorded in Ezra 9 and 10. And that work was published by Bloomsbury in 2013 as Ezra's Social Drama. Don is also interested in issues related to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the South Pacific, such as post-colonialism and climate change. His current research includes reception history, theology in a 3 Tikana context, and the impact of Maori and Pacifica worldviews on biblical interpretation. Today, Don will speak to us about teaching in context, a 3T kind of frame. Don, I'm so glad you're with us. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Yeah, I'm very pleased to be here. And my thanks to you and to Steve for the invitation to join you. I hope that this will be something that will be stimulating and helpful for you all as I share something which has become pretty important to me, really, which is how I make my teaching fit within the context that that I work in. Daniel's already mentioned that I live in New Zealand, not that far from the international date line, which is why I'm ahead of everyone else in terms of time. And I know when Daniel was here, he went and visited a few Lord of the Rings sites here in New Zealand, and that seems to be a lot of what New Zealand is known for these days, is Tolkien's Middle-earth. Yeah. So as I've said, here from New Zealand, we're a small country, 5.3 million people located in the South Pacific. If your geography is not quite that good, there's a little island just to the west of us, which is called Australia. We're made up of several islands, two major ones and a whole bunch of smaller ones. The indigenous people of New Zealand are the Maori. They're a Polynesian people who arrived here in New Zealand approximately 1,000 years ago. To them, this land is Aotearoa, and currently they make up about 17% of the population. And I might just pop my PowerPoint on so that you get some of these figures as we go through. The explorer Captain James Cook anglicised the Dutch name for this land and calling it New Zealand. The British colonised from around the 1840s, although European occupation had actually started as early as about 1791. European New Zealanders are 70% of the population, around about 3.7 million.
Don,
In the 90s.
We can't see your PowerPoint. Are you showing it to
Sorry,
us?
I forgot to share screen, didn't I? Here we go. Thank you. There we go. That might be a little bit better. That might help a little
Great.
bit.
Thanks so much.
In the 1960s, there was a huge wave of Polynesian migration, largely from Samoa and Tonga, but also from a number of other Pacific islands. Auckland, the city I live in, is regarded as the largest Polynesian city in the world. The city itself has 1.7 million people. So out of 5 million, 1.7 of them live in one city. So we're heavily top heavy in a way. About 15% of the population here in Auckland is Polynesian. So although they're 8%, I think, of the population overall, the bulk of them, more than 2/3 of them, live here in Auckland. And it's this mix of ethnic groups, Maori, European, and Polynesian, that are a particular focus for the Anglican Church and its structure here in New Zealand. Although the country is much more broadly multicultural, we've had a huge influx of Asians in the last 40 years or so, and they're now actually 1/3 of the population of New Zealand. If you look at my figures here, you'll see they add up to more than 100%. I did get them from the New Zealand Statistics Department, and the reason they'll be more than 100% is that people are entitled to tick more than one ethnic connection when they do that. So in 1992, the New Zealand Anglican Church responded to calls to decolonise its structures by adopting a new constitution. And that constitution created 3 tikanga, which is a Maori word that has a number of semantic ranges quite quite broad. It can mean a procedure or a custom or a habit or a code. It's also commonly used to refer to culture. So we have a tikanga Māori, which is obviously Indigenous people of New Zealand, tikanga Pākehā, which is Māori word. Pākehā is a Māori word for European. So if you like a settler church or a migrant church, European migrant church, and also tikanga Polynesia. And I should clarify here that the province actually is larger than territorial New Zealand. It covers also Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga. So the bulk of Tikanga Pacifica actually does, or Tikanga Polynesia gets used, both of those terms get used, is actually still back in the islands, although there are a number of Anglican Polynesians, particularly resident here in Auckland. The way that the new structure was set up was that these three tikanga are meant to be interdependent in terms of governance, but autonomous in terms of their own affairs. So we actually have three archbishops. I think there was a primates meeting quite recently. There was, I think, something like 42 archbishops at that primates meeting, and three of them were from New Zealand, because we have, well, actually only two, because there's a vacancy at the moment in Tikanga Pākehā. But we're a little bit, I guess we have numbers beyond our population numbers in many ways from that point of view. But because we have three archbishops, they have to work quite closely together. They consult over pretty well everything, so that governance matters are done in a consented kind of a way. And they're supported by a General Synod that meets every 2 years. And in fact, that this year's General Synod is just coming to a close this weekend. So while the church is structured on this along these ethnic lines, the issue is that membership is not. So there are numbers of Pākehā, so that's European New Zealanders, who are in Maori churches, and several who are ministers in those churches. There are Maori and Polynesian people and ministers in Pākehā churches. Officially, the Constitution says that people can choose to worship in the way that they feel most comfortable with. So there is no, although we have this ethnic division, it actually doesn't in some ways affect too much the membership of churches, although Maori churches tend to be predominantly Maori, and Pākehā churches, well, actually they're usually pretty multicultural, and I know there's at least one Maori church which actually has a majority of Pākehā people in it, so it's quite a mixed kind of situation. And of course, one of the issues that we've got is that our underlying structure doesn't recognise other ethnicities, and Pākehā tends to be the default tikanga for other migrants. And that means that we now have quite a lot of Asians within our churches as well. And one of the, I guess, underlying issues that there is with this structure is that they really don't have an official place or context. And that I've run a few conferences around issues to do with the Three Tikanga Church, and that's been one of the things that's tended to boil up a little bit, is the lack of, well, an official definition of Pākehā as descendants of European New Zealanders, but in actual fact, the church, the Pākehā is entirely multicultural, really. Now, just going to pause there just for a second to say that that's a lot of information all at once, and probably it's a really strange kind of structure for most of you, and you've probably got quite a few questions. I'll see what I can do to help you with that a little bit later, but because it's not the main focus of my talk, I won't sort of pause just at the moment to address all of those ideas that might be running around in your head.
Don, can I just say one thing? I just want to make sure. So far, we have one slide. Is that correct? There's just been one slide with one bullet.
Yes. And it actually should have 2 bullet points on it. My apologies. So there was
okay, good.
a second one.
Sure. Great.
And
Thanks.
I had, and this is the one that I wanted to come to now, was I thought my problem is that I'm touching my screen and I've got my PowerPoint clicker on another screen. So I need to make sure I hit it twice to remind it to move on. I work, as Daniel indicated, at the College of St. John the Evangelist, commonly known by most people as St. John's or St. John's Theological College, and it is the provincial college for our church. So in theory, we cater to the whole church. So unlike much bigger populations where you have any number of seminaries and they tend to develop a flavor, and we've got all of those flavors mixed together basically in the one college. So we're a small church in one sense and just a small college, but we need to cater to a broad range of students and ministry contexts. And one of the things that is a part of our context is that we are expected to expose all of our students to Maori and Pacifica cultures as much as to New Zealand European culture or Western frameworks. And apart from the governance structures of the church, the primary place where this three tikanga structure finds its focus actually is here at St. John's College, where we have to be quite conscious about being a three tikanga church and incorporating that into our teaching program. So for me, that meant that when I came here and began to think about that, I started to think about ways in which I could introduce that three tikanga flavour into what I was teaching, and particularly into my introduction to the Hebrew Bible / Old Testament course that I teach. It could be argued that not every course, and it's true that not every course easily accommodates this, but I felt that it was something that was appropriate to do with my Hebrew Bible class. So I kind of dipped my toe in this to start with, and decided that rather than do some radical kind of change to my program, that I would do an incremental sort of a change. And so what I did actually was call on my colleagues, my Māori and Pacifica colleagues, and ask and have a chat with them. We talked about where the connections were that I was thinking about between their cultures and Old Testament studies, and we agreed on some topics that we could put together. And then I recruited those colleagues into my paper so that I had their cultural expertise to help me with what I was doing. The list we came down to, I'll come to that in just a moment, but perhaps first of all, I might just mention that sitting behind this, I had three aims that I wanted that are interrelated that I wanted to achieve. The first of those is actually just simply about building cognitive structures for the students to take on new information from, so that rather than the students sort of struggling around with a whole bunch of new ideas, if I could give them some kind of immediate example that would help them. So, for instance, to tell them that actually First Chronicles 1-9 was not wasted paper. All of that genealogy actually has a role and a purpose. And if they get to grips with how significant genealogy is in traditional cultures, that actually will help them do that and also see how it's practical outcome. So building cognitive structures, which is relevant for all my students. It's relevant for those that don't know anything about Māori or Pacifica cultures, but actually for those who are Māori and Pacifica and know something of that heritage, and not all of them do, then it tells them that the structure that they come preloaded with actually is useful for them in terms of the way that they interpret the Old Testament, which leads me somewhat onto my second point in this, which is that one of the things that I wanted my Māori and Pacifica students to do was to begin to see that their cultures actually had relevance for their reading of the Old Testament, and they could actually see something of themselves in that text. And so yes, those preloaded assumptions that they had actually were not only quite helpful for making them helping them make meaning of the text, but actually were a corrective often for some of the more Western frameworks that perhaps they'd been educated into, which probably were distorting some of their understandings to a large degree. And the other thing that I wanted to do, which might seem a little bit more contrary to that, but one thing that I find I have spent a lot of time with students is reinforcing the issue of distance. That when our students read out the Hebrew Bible, they are not reading a modern text. They are not reading in with the kinds of or the literature that they're reading is not stuff that they come preloaded with from a genre point of view. They don't have other necessary analogies within the things they read, say for apocalyptic, for instance. So I wanted to reinforce that difference that was there. For Maori, I wanted them to realize that the Old Testament, and for Pacifica, that the Old Testament's not a Western text. And although most of them have at least 1 foot, if not more than that, in a Western worldview, I wanted them to recognize that some of the other aspects from their traditional cultures actually were much more helpful for them. Obviously for my European descent students, it's much more about them just getting to grips that these assumptions that people often have when they come to the Hebrew Bible, because of their Western education and framework, actually need to be significantly modified if they're actually going to read the Old Testament well. The ideas we started with some 7 years or so ago now have been adjusted a little as we've gone along, but we're still largely doing what we were at the beginning. I call these cultural windows, hence the title at the top of my PowerPoint. And although in reality they're probably more cultural lenses, but I didn't worry too much about the semantics. The current course has 7 cultural windows. So the ones that I have on the PowerPoint there: creation stories, genealogies, slave heritage, selecting a king, Maori prophets as an introduction to Old Testament prophets, and there's a lot of crossover there. Waiata-tangi, tangi is the word, is the word for cry, to cry in Maori, and waiata is a song. So the laments. And also mātauranga Māori. Mātauranga is a word that roughly would translate as wisdom. So we look at traditional notions of wisdom within Māoridom and pick that up in terms of our wisdom literature as well. Basically, the process is I ask each of my colleagues who contributes to this course to give a 15-minute presentation on the topic. And then I follow that up with a little process to make connections between that cultural perspective and our Hebrew Bible Old Testament literature. Usually that follow-up involves some kind of discussion group workshop or something of that nature, so the students get to grapple a little bit with the text and those ideas and see what they can come up with and what they can derive from the material that they've got in front of them. To give you some examples of how this is working out, I'll give you 3 examples. The first example was the first on that list, which is creation stories. I actually ask for 2 creation stories. Normally, our tikanga Māori, and we have 3 deans in this college, 1 for each tikanga. So I usually have the tikanga Māori dean come and talk about Māori creation stories, and Pacifica, usually our dean of Polynesia, who's got a very English name. He's Frank Smith, but he is fully Samoan. Come and tell us, although at times we've had postgraduate students do some others, Tongan creation stories and so on. The reason I have two at this one is because it's the first a cultural window I do, and I want to establish that both tikanga are contributing to the process. So they present their creation stories and describe how they function within their cultural context. And then I get the students to spend a short time in small groups comparing those stories with Genesis 1 to 3 and thinking about what it means in terms of their understanding of those stories. There are a couple of things which I'm kind of looking for to come out, but I often find that they do arise pretty naturally the out of the discussion that the students have. Um, and one of those is that the purpose of the stories in Maori and in other Polynesian cultures is about worldview formation. So the creation narratives respond to fundamental concepts of identity and meaning. And so we discuss that purpose of the biblical creation stories. What important information do they convey? Did they convey in the past? What important information may they therefore convey for us today? By establishing that we're dealing with them as origin stories and that they're about worldview formation, I find that a lot of the barriers, particularly that westernized people have about these stories, get dealt with a little bit easier. I find that I don't have to spend so much time emphasizing issues of genre, and I don't find that the scientific questions and so on intrude so much on the discussion. Almost, well, I was going to say almost inevitably, but we're getting a change of generation where that's actually not as so much to the forefront as it was in years gone by. But it's still quite frequent that someone's going to raise a question about evolution or the age of the earth or science in the Bible or whatever it might be. But I find that if we've established issues of genre quite early on and that they've got some assent to that, then actually dealing with those issues is not quite so difficult. The other thing that we notice is that traditional cultures tend to have multiple creation stories because they serve different purposes and explain different things within their culture. And of course, this also parallels out to creation stories in Genesis. And most students are aware that there are two creation stories, but they've never really thought about the implications of that. So it's interesting to see the light go on for some of them about that. I'm also surprised that occasionally I have a student who pops up and says that they've never noticed that there were two stories. They seem to somehow have elided the two. That really surprised me when that began to turn up in class. So creation stories is kind of a foundation setting one. The next one that we move on to, and I should have put up my key observation, sorry, I'm not, is genealogies. This is one I'm spending quite a lot of time with at the moment. The Maori word for genealogy is whakapapa. And a whakapapa is much more expansive than a simple genealogical list. In fact, it's a core meaning-making principle in Maori culture. Maori scholars talk about whakapapa as a fundamental epistemological framework. That is, they think about everything in a relational way. So genealogy is not simply about human relationships, it's about the relationship between everything in the created order. So every plant, every animal has a whakapapa. The sweet potato, which in New Zealand we know as the kumara, has a whakapapa. The flax plant, harakeke in Māori, has a whakapapa. And all of those whakapapas usually link back to a traditional god. And interestingly enough, we also have a whakapapa back through all of the traditional gods as well. The whole framework is set up in that way. So everything about their culture is framed around this relational idea that we understand things because of how they are connected in the world around about us. Now, Maori are probably a little bit extreme here, but I mean, this is not anything new for most traditional cultures around the world. Generally, genealogies are quite an important part of how those societies work. But picking that up then and beginning to look at the range of genealogies that there are in our Old Testament. I mentioned the early chapters in Chronicles, but of course we've got a couple of migration lists in Ezra 2 and Nehemiah 7. We've got a whole bunch of genealogies of various sorts through the book of Genesis, which is largely where I start off with all this. And of course, Genesis also has a genealogical structure. And one of the things that we discuss in here actually is how that structure is fitted into the book of Genesis. One of the areas that I'm actually continuing to work on with research is the problems that I have with our Western scholars who recognize that structure is there, but then don't do anything with it. So we have a structure which is deeply embedded, a genealogical structure in Genesis, but when it comes to discussions of genre, it generally gets ignored. In fact, an enormous number of scholars actually don't even try and give Genesis a genre. They just talk about the subgenres within the book. But I tell my students that I think whakapapa is genealogical historiography. And I find that my Maori and Pacifica students tend to say, well, yeah, isn't that obvious? Now, that might be a controversial kind of statement. And I know that when people like Jan van Setters proposed that in the 1980s, he got shot down by a whole lot of people. But I'm actually just reading a book at the moment that is arguing, in fact, that genealogical structure is actually quite firmly embedded in the Eastern Mediterranean in the ancient world, particularly with the Greeks, but also to some degree with the Phoenicians. So there's possible links as to how that may have become part of our Old Testament. And I'm happy to pick that up if people want to ask some more questions about that later. My third example is slave heritage. Now, not a lot of people actually in the South Pacific realize that in the colonial era here in the South Pacific, that slavery was a feature. It's something that's kind of been elided from much of our history. But this is something that's actually particular to our Fijian Anglicans, whose ancestors were originally blackbirded. So they were kidnapped in places like the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu and taken to places like Queensland and Australia or to Fiji to work in the plantations. After 1833, when the English government outlawed slavery, there was a replacement very quickly. In 1834, we have the beginning of what was called indentured labour, which in fact wasn't that much different from the slavery that had preceded it. And indentured labour not only picked up those Melanesian people, but also actually people from India as well. So there is a large population of Indians now in Fiji, again, who are the descendants of people that were indentured labourers who were brought to that area. So most Anglicans in Fiji have a connection back to those folk because when the mission agencies divided up the South Pacific for missions, Fiji was actually a Methodist mission, not an Anglican one. But because there were British government officials there who were Anglican, there were some services held. And there had already been a mission actually that had run from New Zealand. In fact, just down the hill from me is a place called Mission Bay that was a place where mission to Melanesia, particularly to the Solomon Islands, was initiated by Bishop George Selwyn who actually appointed Bishop John Patterson as a bishop to Melanesia and sent him off. So many of these people that travelled from or were blackbirded, kidnapped from the Solomons and brought to Fiji, for instance, were already baptized Anglicans. And so I have Aseta Mataviti Tulavu, who is a colleague here, and I get her to come and tell her personal story. And to talk about the implications for her of such as her inability to own land and her restricted access to education that come from being a second generation Solomoni Fijian, despite having also Fijian blood in her family. She's not regarded as Indigenous. So the insight into the intergenerational effects of that heritage becomes really quite a powerful window as we look into the Exodus story and the continued celebration of the Passover amongst the Israelite culture. So that's 3 examples of how I've tried to incorporate traditional cultures and their historical experiences into our New Zealand Anglican, or from our New Zealand Anglican Church and wider New Zealand context into my teaching of Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. Started at 7 years ago now, and I've taught it every semester, plus I've done some block courses and some online courses and some hybrid courses using this model. So I've taught it something like 10 or 11 or so times, I think, over those 7 years. And as I say, the topics have been adjusted a little. But I've been really encouraged by the way that students have responded to it and it's now become quite embedded in the way that I teach. I'm very much an outsider in this whole process. I'm a cultural anthropologist in a way, in that I come at this with a very hybridized kind of an understanding of Maori and Pacifica cultures, and which is one of the reasons why I ask my colleagues to do the teaching. They're the cultural experts, and they can give a much more genuine presentation than myself. I need to, and I'm still learning a great deal, but as I learn, I find that there are extra places where I can start to think about how the connections can be made. And my hope is that if I see this, and I'm getting towards the end of my teaching career now, that there will be others who will pick this up. And currently we have very few Māori or Pacifica people with PhDs in biblical studies, but there are a few coming on, and I'd hope that some of them would be able to pick this up and take it much further than I am able to. How are we going for time? Have I got a little bit more?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, if you want to keep going.
Let me just give you a couple of sort of responses. My responses from students come from 3 sources. We do have a formal survey that we do at the end of courses, and I've got questions in there about how students have engaged with this. I also have the feedback that I get from a classroom situation and also from personal contact and discussion with individual students. And have found that there's been quite good engagement with this process, particularly from my Pacifica and Māori students. It's great when my Pacifica students are kind of hiding down in the back row there, trying not to be noticed. And Frank Smith, our Dean for Tikanga Māori, Tikanga Pacifica, steps up to start talking about creation stories, whatever. I find those students immediately sit up. They take more notice, and they become more engaged in the process. We had a fantastic class a year or 2 back when my class was actually almost all Pacifica and Māori students. And I think about 2/3 of them were Māori. And I lost the class for a little while as they got into this really intense discussion amongst each other about the need for a much stronger interaction between their understanding of the scriptures and their own culture. It was really exciting to watch it. So those things have really encouraged me with those sorts of reactions. And I am seeing that Māori and Pacifica students are recognizing that this preloaded knowledge that they already have from their cultures is actually valuable for them in terms of reading the Hebrew Bible. So, and they seem to take to that with a certain amount of clarity. So, I am really pleased with how all that has played out. And I like that where I'm finding that students get a handle on genre so much better than by doing this, rather than for me spending quite a lot of time trying to explain what what genre is and help them sort of prize it away from the preconceptions they often have of Western genre, that it has to be history because that's the kind of the way I've been reading it, etc. The other impact it's had has actually been the impact on me as a person and as a scholar. Um, as I've learned more, I've become more sensitized to the cultural biases and how they affect our reading of the scriptures and of the kinds of things that we end up getting focused on. So, for instance, as I mentioned, I think Western scholarship has a problem with the genealogical structure in Genesis. And the reasons that they don't take it seriously are actually very poor reasons. And I think it shows that we've got a very narrow view of what we understand genealogy to be. But when you come to traditional cultures, it's always much broader than just who my forebears are. Connections to land and to other things that are tied up there. So for me, I think it's been very helpful for me in terms of my reading and understanding, and I think I've gained some insights as I've seen these cultures in action or understood a little bit better what's there, and thought actually that probably makes more sense for my imagination and how I perceive what's going on. The other aspect of it is that it's actually affected. Um, Not well, it's affected the content of my course to a certain degree. Obviously, I've had to make room for these 15-minute presentations in my program, and that's valuable teaching time that I've kind of had to lose in one sense. But actually, that's been good because I'm a content focused kind of a person, and the emphasis to push me away from having to do or focus so much on content and deal at a more conceptual level to some degree with material, I think has actually been very good for me and for my teaching, and I think ultimately for my students because of that. Um, Tied up in all of that also is that it has also impacted me in terms of my research. As I say, am hoping that I can do some more work in Genesis over the next couple of years. I'd like to write some certain amount of material around issues of Genesis and how that genealogical structure holds it together, how in fact some things that we naturally do with Genesis now, like divide it at chapter 11, um, Genesis 1 to 11 and then 12 to 50 is an entirely different story for us. And yet if we take seriously that that's all bound together by genealogical structure, I think that will change our perspectives and our reading of Genesis. So yeah, quite a lot of work that I'm sparked to begin to work on and see if I can do something positive about. So that's largely my my presentation. There's lots more I could say. I've actually got another couple of thousand words sitting here in front of me, but you don't want me to go on for that long, and it's probably better if I interact with answer questions and so on before rather than roll on from here.
Thank you so much, Don. I really appreciate it. That was wonderful. Would you mind turning off the share screen for a moment so we can have some discussion? Yes, thank you. So the original plan was to break off into small groups, but Andy, what do you think? Since we're already kind of an intimate group, maybe just stay in a large group so we can.
Yeah,
ask
Steve and I
questions.
chatted about that already. I think let's there's so much that's rich here. So I'm Andy Guffey, by the way. I'm also a member of the executive committee, tasked with putting you all in breakout rooms and things. And we're just gonna jettison all that because there's a lot of rich stuff here, and I imagine you all have brilliant questions. I have a fair few myself, but I think at this point we'll just open it up for conversation for anybody who wants to pop in with some questions or has anything they'd like to talk about. Yeah, go ahead, Amy.
Ooh, is it okay if a guest asks a question?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Don, for that presentation. Really interesting. I'm designing a course. Actually, I'm going to be teaching Hebrew Bible at Nate's this fall. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about Westerman's differentiation of origin stories and creation stories, of their purpose, of their directionality, of the impact on the culture where they derive from. I'm doing some work in Genesis. And so a lot of the things that you were saying were kind of bubbling up for me. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, a very good question, and I'm just trying for the life of me to clarify or remember what Westerman had to say about about this actually.
Well, he was, and there's also some push against, from an indigenous perspective, there's some push against scholars like Middleton, who may see some of the static or inanimate, use the word inanimate, and then a filling, and then it becomes, or even some scholars say life began on day 4 of creation. So just kind of some of those things are rumbling in my mind.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we go to the first Toledo formula in Genesis 2:4, most scholars, just reading David Carr on this, talks about how the content stretches the structure. He says because you can't have the heavens and the earth produce human beings. And yet when I talk to my Pacific and Maori students, they say, why not? We're intimately connected with the land. We come from the land. Why can't that be a valid way of thinking about what's going on here? So, yeah, I think the reasons that we have for that, for saying that this doesn't quite fit, are actually a wrong perception, and they are based much more narrowly on our modern Western idea of genealogy, which is much more about, a hobby these days of tracing your family lineage, than it is about an understanding of life and your world and where you fit, how you relate, and all of those kinds of things. Yeah, and it seems to me, and I probably need to go back and look at Westerman on this. That's a good clue actually for me in terms of my own thinking, is that it's very difficult to then separate one story out and say that this one's about origin, but that one's not about origin. And one of the things I like about Kathleen O'Connor's commentary on Genesis is that she says outright, these are origin stories. And she is characterizing the whole of the book that way. And I applaud her for that, because I think it's one of the more positive kinds of comments. Whereas, some others recent commentaries, like say John Goldengay's one, for instance. Now, I mean, I love John Goldengay as a scholar, but he avoids entirely. He gives you all the subgenres, but he won't talk about the text as a whole. And I think, how can you say to people, this is the kind of literature it is, and therefore this is the way that we make meaning out of it, if you can't say to them this? It seems, until we get a handle on genre, we've got nothing to work with in terms of making meaning out of a text, have we? I mean, I think that was, to jump to New Testament, Richard Burridge. I loved his book on the Gospels as biography, as ancient biography, and and he makes that problem right at the very beginning. If we say the Gospels are sui generis, then what are the rules that we read them by? Because we don't have any forebears or any other thing to connect them to that explains to us how we read from it. And I think we've got that problem to a certain degree with the Old Testament. Sorry, I'm talking too much here.
Oh, no, that's really helpful. Thanks. I appreciate your work.
What other questions have we got?
I'm curious about your talking about genres that you so because of your final slide, you said that people come to appreciate the genres, but you're not using Western genres. Is that correct? Are you using something else?
I guess it's a little bit mixed. I usually tell my students right on day one that most of their education has not prepared them well to read the Old Testament because it contains literature that they've got no experience of from other places. So I'm going to ask them to relearn some of the ways that they think about those genre. And I mean, I think we've had to do the same with the New Testament, particularly more recently with the Gospels. So I guess when I tell my students that Genesis is whakapapa, I am not using a Western way of doing that, although I could do so perhaps by talking about origin stories, which seems to be becoming, I mentioned Kathleen O'Connor's book, but I've just come across and I've only really just started reading in the last few days, this book by Guy Darshan, which is called Stories of Origins, the Bible and the Ancient Mediterranean Literature. And he's a Israeli biblical scholar who is arguing that the genealogical structure that is in Genesis is actually native to the Eastern Mediterranean, drawing most of his examples from Greek stories where they're heavily used. But he says he has a very interesting statement at the beginning, actually, that if you go back to all traditional cultures, you'll find that this structure is used to some degree. But we've been rather focused on Mesopotamian, I guess, literature as a way of evaluating this. And one of the areas where our Old Testament does not merge with Mesopotamian literature is in that genealogical structure. It's not there in things like the Assyrian king lists or the other material that we often look to. So yeah, I am kind of forging my own path to a certain degree, but yeah, I'm using just completely lost it off the top of my head now. The textbook that I get students to read, which I actually find is very helpful, is how can I have forgotten this already? Is Rolf Jacobson and Michael Chan's and Introducing the Old Testament Historical and Theological Survey. They do, I think, quite a good job of establishing some guidelines in terms of genre with each of the books of the Hebrew Bible. So I picked that one up and tried using it this year. I hadn't used them before, but students have been responding to it quite well. I've had some quite good feedback.
Well, thank you.
Right. Do we have other questions? We're getting close to the end of our time, I think, but Frank, you've got something.
Yeah.
Yes, I have a question.
All right. Let's have Frank first and then Bob. I think that was
That's right.
okay. So we'll do Frank
Yeah.
first and then Bob.
Okay, I guess my question in terms of scholarship on the Pauline corpus, do you have any ideas about points of contact between the traditional cultures that you're dealing with, and also things like doctrines, justification, sanctification, etc., or is that just in? Is there a connection there that you can fathom, perhaps?
I'm going to be teaching Introduction to New Testament in the coming semester, and I've been racking my brain over this, Frank, because I haven't made many connections yet, and I'm struggling. And the Pauline material is one area where I haven't really come up with very much, and I haven't had a chance to sit down with my colleagues and talk about it. One of the things that has happened, particularly with Maori culture, is that the early missionary movement was very effective here. And there was a huge movement to Christianity amongst Maori. The missionaries came here in the beginning was 1814, and the first missionaries were here just before 1820. There was not much movement until the 1830s, and then we got a whole range. So Maori culture now is actually deeply intertwined with Christianity in a number of ways. So their traditions have been quite heavily modified by Christianity in a number of ways. So that's also something that's going on here, is that we've got that I guess I'm trying to negotiate, because they have adopted so many biblical ideas. In fact, when there were colonial wars here in the 1860s, one of the things on my list is Maori prophets. Now, the Maori prophets were Christian Maori by and large, who were inspired by the Old Testament prophets to respond to the crisis that their people were facing. So they had already adopted a biblical approach, if you like, and then sought to interpret for their people how God might be with them in that crisis that they faced of huge numbers of European colonizers coming here, wars, confiscation of land, and so on. Yeah, sorry, I'm drifting off topic now, but I can't, I'm sorry, answer your Pauline question so well at the moment, because it's still an area that I need to do quite a lot of work on.
That might address
you.
a little bit of George's question, but maybe if we can have George follow up real quick, and then Bob will get to you, just because it's also related to Paul.
So I'm very interested in your talk. I was actually blessed to be part of a teaching team from the National Church in America, from the evangelism department, that came to New Zealand in 2017, and we did a conference in Auckland. And then I got to spend the next 3 weeks traveling in New Zealand, both the North Island and South Island, and all, as I fathomed driving on the wrong side of the road and all, which I was always scared by. But anyway, and now I'm an independent Pauline scholar with my book Paul Found in His Letters, and I'm just was thinking about how Paul talks about the creation that is groaning with labor pains and all, and he has this marvelous sense of the recreation of the earth, of the world, as it was meant to be and all. And so his apocalyptic thinking is not the end of the world, but the recreation of creation and all, and restoration. So it's really, really marvelous stuff that he was wrestling with. Plus, if you were going to be one of his communities, you had to be immersed in the Hebraic stories. I mean, he doesn't hesitate to make an allusion to Abraham or to Adam and all. It was his second language, as all, just poured out of him, I think, from the side all the time. So I think that's for me, it was a marvelous revelation of who he is for us, and how important that Hebraic story is, and all, if we're going to be in the mode of a new creation theology. So I wonder how that plays out in what you're talking about.
Well, I think you've just given me a little key. actually, George. I really appreciate that, because I think that picking up on what I've done in Old Testament and bringing that into those places where the Old Testament and the New Testament intersect actually is one of the places where I think I can tease this out a little bit more. Yeah, so I'm really keen to actually go sit down with some of that material and think about what I might be able to pull out in terms of some discussion groups or something with my students. I think you've just offered me a little gift in what you've said.
Yeah, thanks, George. Thanks, Don. That is good stuff. We're out of time, but Bob, you've been very patient. So let's try to fit you in before
I
we,
want to
yeah.
I want to come back to the question first of genealogy and second of genre very quickly. I wonder if you ever think of everything in Genesis as being a song, something meant to be sung. And does singing play any part in the genealogical stories, the creation stories of the Maori?
Chanting is very much a part of Maori culture, and you do a lot of chanting. When we have a Eucharist in Maori language, we chant a huge amount, the creeds and whole sections of prayers and so on. So that certainly is. I hadn't actually thought about that in connection with Genesis at all. But that's, again, this is great having this, because you're offering me all kinds of things that I can go and follow up on and think a little bit more about.
Well, a very, very quick follow-up. The opening of Bereshit bara Elohim is a major third, major triad. And if you look at the opening of Job, it mimics it. And I think it's just fascinating to put the music to the text and hear it in a completely different way.
Oh,
Anyway, that's my area of expertise, and I apologize for mentioning it, but it's an international forum, and I think we should know about this stuff.
Absolutely.
So thank you for letting me be part of the community for a few minutes.
Of course. Thank you, Bob, for that question. That's lovely. And Don, thank you. I think we need to wrap up our discussion at this point. But obviously, if you want to get in touch with Don with further thoughts and questions, I'll bet he would be okay with that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this has been so stimulating for me. These questions. This is great.
And I think we have a few announcements before we close our meeting.
Yes, we'll begin with Frank Hughes making an announcement. You'll need to unmute, Frank.
Right. I have the honor of being the first and fourth Secretary Treasurer. And so there are a number of ways that you can pay your dues. Our dues for regular people, regular scholars, are $25, 25 US dollars. And we can receive this in a number of ways. We can send you an email with a QR code on it. But if you simply go to PayPal and type in Anglican Association of Biblical Scholars, that's the name of our PayPal account, and send us $25, we will be able to, I'll be able to figure out who you are and who's paying. You can get a receipt on PayPal, or I can write you a receipt in the old-fashioned way. The other thing you can do is, if it is difficult for you to send money to me in the United States, you can simply email me or call me and say you are coming to the meeting, and I'll make a dinner reservation for you. So our dues are $25. No one has paid any dues during the year 2024 yet, but there are a number of ways to pay. And when we first started in the 1990s, we had checks, and some of them were Canadian checks, and that was a little complicated. But there are a lot of different ways that you can pay your dues. And we look forward to your support.
Thank you, Frank. Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'm sorry that Amy has already left. You'll see there's a connection between this meeting and that. We have just started last year to gather in person. We had a COVID break like a lot of people did, and we will be gathering in San Diego just ahead of the meeting of the SBL and AAR in November. And our main meeting will be on Friday night, November the 22nd. We can't actually confirm the church will be meeting yet, but we're working on that. But it will be off-site. We'll gather in an Episcopal church, and we invite you to come at any point when you can. I know people arrive at different moments, but we will have some time just to gather and greet each other. We will reunite in the Holy Eucharist, celebrated at 5 o'clock. We will have a catered dinner, and we will ask that you make reservations for that. But the information about that will be coming in the late summer. We'll make a kind of menu that could work for anyone. And Frank had told you about the different ways to pay for that. And then our topic will be exploring the First Nations version of the New Testament. We've had a series of Zoom meetings on teaching in context that really prepared us to look at this particular context. And then we will close with a short compline. But our presenters for, our presenters are going to be Chris Hokla-Tube and Amy Allen, whom you met tonight. And both of them are involved with NATES. You heard her talk about NATES, this Indigenous Learning Committee, learning community. Chris is the Director of Graduate Studies, and Amy is a PhD student, and you heard her also say she's going to be teaching Hebrew Bible this fall. So they're going to work out how they do this, and they'll tell us a little bit about NATES and give us some good examples of the First Nations New Testament, which has come out already, and maybe some more bits about the First Nations Psalms and Proverbs. We also have a meeting on Sunday. This has been going on for a number of years, and it's very popular. We'll have this on site. It'll be summer room assigned by the SBL, a Holy Eucharist at sort of lunchtime on Sunday, November 24th, between 11:45 and 12:45. Anyone can be welcome, and we will try to accommodate all different sorts of ways of being Anglican into that tradition. Hope to see you there.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And now Andy will close us in a benediction. And then as he prepares to do that, I just want to thank you for being here and look forward to having you join us in November, if at all possible.
And this benediction comes from the New Zealand Prayer Book. So let us pray. May God, whom Jesus called Abba, embrace you in love forever. May God, the servant, bear your burdens with you. May God, the Paraclete, grant you life in one another. So may the blessing of God, Abba, servant, Paraclete, be with you always. Amen. Thank you all. Thank you, Don.
Yes, thank you, Don, very much for being with us. And we thank all of you for being here with us. It's been a good evening or a morning, depending on where you live. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.